This section traces how the definition of a brain-computer interface shifted over 4 decades, and why that shift is the chapter's actual claim. Vidal's coinage in 1973 bought the field its name, but the moving part is the definition itself. In 1999, a BCI meant output substitution, messages bypassing the peripheral nerves and muscles, as Wolpaw and colleagues stated it in 2002. By 2012, it is any system that replaces, restores, enhances, supplements, or replaces, restores, enhances, supplements, or improves natural CNS output. The muscle bypass clause vanishes. What remains is a closed loop between measured CNS activity and an environment that answers back. That widening is what admits passive and effective. BCIs, hybrids, and neuroergonomics, everything the handbook's 6 parts then cover. Read the chronology backwards. From the definition, each new paradigm is a boundary the prior definition could not hold. This section explains why one definition organizes an entire handbook. Wolpaw's definition is the whole chapter. A brain-computer interface carries messages that never pass through the brain's normal output pathways of peripheral nerves and muscles. Everything else follows as choices along orthogonal axes. There are 4 such axes. Which physical correlate you read? Electrical, magnetic, or hemodynamic? How much surgery you pay for resolution? Which signal pattern you exploit? P300, SSCP, ERD, and ERS, or SCP? And whether the user drives the system, a stimulus does, or SCP. The 4-stage chain stays: invariant, pattern generation, acquisition, feature extraction, classification. Only the axes vary. Tom typing, "Dear Samantha," by mentally counting flashes anchors the whole scheme. This chapter is the handbook's coordinate system, and every chapter after it is a point inside it. This section explains how modern neuroscience becomes importable into non-invasive brain-computer interfaces, and why the obstacle was a matter of coordinates rather than knowledge. 2 fields read the same brain in incompatible coordinates. BCI records scalp potentials, sensor space. Neuroscience, since the fMRI era speaks in cortical location, source space. Findings accumulated in the second are unimportable into the first, which is why SMR, P300, and SSVEP still dominate. All 3 predate cortical mapping and still rest on the physiology available then. Ronke-Wicks, Larson, and Lee offer a change of basis. Source imaging inverts the forward model and re-expresses EEG on the cortical surface. The neuroimaging library becomes callable, regions of interest to prune features, cross-subject normalization to seed transfer learning. The chapter's place in the arc, the bottleneck was representational, and coordinates are where a stalled field gets unstuck. This section explains what makes a brain-computer interface passive, and how its 4 categories form a single ladder. A brain signal counts as input the moment nobody produced it on purpose. That single move, spontaneity as an input channel, is what the chapter names passive BCI. Its 4 categories are 1 axis unrolled, how far the machine's response reaches back into its own next measurement. Assessment reads and stops. Open loop adaptation acts once. Closed loop adaptation acts upon the very state it measures. Automated adaptation stores states against contexts, builds a model of you, and acts before input arrives. Interactivity is the depth of that feedback path. Kroll, Andreessen, and Zander end where the ladder points. Once the system has learned your own subjective responses, merely the interaction itself remains. This section explains how brain-computer interface work turns from a device that acts for the patient into an instrument that measures the patient. BCI research began as a bypass for people who could not move. This chapter turns it into an instrument for people whose inner state itself is in question. The move is diagnostic before assistive. A P300 response to a counted tone proves command following, and command following is evidence of awareness, so the classifier becomes a consciousness detector for patients whom bedside observation misdiagnoses up to 42% of the time. The same inversion runs the Strokoff Recovery X gates. Feedback on verified motor imagery rather than reading intent out, which restores the heavy impairing that conventional therapy breaks by rewarding trials. The patient was not performing. One primitive, two faces. When the loop closes only on real cortical activity, measurement and therapy are the same act. This section explains how therapeutic uses of brain-computer interfaces are organized. Therapy here is a contingency structure, and the hardware merely implements it. McFarland's Table 5.1 sorts 5 rehabilitation paradigms: neurofeedback, imagery enhancement, closing the sensory motor loop, trained preparation, and state-dependent trial presentation. It sorts them along 4 axes: the context the brain state is trained in, whether feedback is delivered, the therapeutic goal, and whether brain states are treated as static traits or as reactive transients of labile networks. Hold the axes and you can generate the 6th paradigm yourself. The chapter's work in the book's arc is the pivot from a brain-computer interface as replacement output to a brain-computer interface as plasticity guide, where the artificial output exists to reshape the brain producing it. Proof of principle everywhere, efficacy nowhere, because almost no study documents what the EEG actually learned. This section sets out the reversal. Dambrot performs on the causal arrow of tool-making. A self-organizing, self-modifying organ recruits the sensory and motor systems in order to identify patterns in the external world, to model it, and to modify it. It files the body itself among the external things it works on. Neuroprosthetics follows as the terminal case, the tool-making substrate, turning its accumulated technique on itself. Closed. Loop neurofeedback is the moment that arc closes. 2 genetic accidents bought the capacity. The ARHGAP11B duplication tripled cortical volume, and SRGAP2 together with FOXP2 reshaped connectivity. So an Egyptian wooden toe and ultrasonic neural dust sit on one continuous gradient. That gives the handbook its teleology. Every device chapter after this one is an instance of the same self-application, differing only in how deep the loop reaches. This section explains how aging enters the design of steady-state visual evoked potential interfaces as a calibration parameter. Aging enters here as a calibration parameter. What the field called BCI illiteracy, users whose intentions the classifier never resolves, largely dissolves once stimulation frequency, target count, and classification time window are tuned per person. Across 3 of the author's own field studies on the same paradigm, literacy climbs from 86.5% to 97.7% to 100%. Elderly users are the instrument that exposes the axis. Their correct selections cluster above 2.03 seconds, while young users' selections fall below it, so a fixed time window fails them for reasons that have nothing to do with the brain signal. The chapter's function in the handbook is to convert SS4EP from a technique into a design space. This section explains how Effective brain-computer interfacing changes what a brain-computer interface fundamentally is. A brain-computer interface normally decodes an intention. The user issues something, the machine reads it. Daily relocates the readout to a state the user never issues, affect, expressed as coordinates in a valence and arousal plane. That one substitution changes the type of the system. The interface becomes a controller. The ABCMI, the case study running through chapters 8 and 9, reads affect, generates music, and the music moves the affect it just measured. The output acts back on its own input. What you gain is a channel costing the user no effort. What you pay is the reference. Intent has a ground truth, the experimenter fixed in advance. A felt emotion has only the user's own. Feel trace. That is why validation, rather than detection, is the binding constraint. This section explains why practicality is the constraint that reaches downward through every hardware layer, and what 3 demonstration systems reveal when they share one stack. Practicality propagates backwards. Once the binding constraint is that an untrained person mounts the headset alone in a noisy office, it reaches down to electrode polymer, amplifier placement at the contact, continuous impedance readout, every layer redesigned by one downstream demand. The demonstration, 4 active dry channels matched dense gel arrays on motor imagery, so the cumbersome setup was buying nothing the application needed. The 3 anchors, competitive, toy car racing, the juggler's brain and body sonification, the child vigilance monitor, share one stack and vary only the actuation channel, making actuation the free parameter and the hardware the invariant. Entertainment serves as proving ground because there a bad experience registers immediately as refusal. This section explains what every brain-computer music interface has in common and what actually separates one from another. The pipeline is always the same, 4 stages: signal in, filtering, mapping, sound out. Everything that distinguishes one system from another sits in the mapping. That is the chapter's whole claim. Brain-computer music interfacing advances, no brain-computer interface technology of its own. Chapter 11 calls it an engineering problem of implementation rather than advancement, so its history reads as a taxonomy of who adapts to whom. User-oriented mappings obey the performer. Computer-oriented mappings obey the performer. Computer-oriented mappings make the performer MIDI calls it in teachin'. No compings learn each other. Lucier's music for solo performer through to effect-driven affective systems is one trajectory, with the mapping migrating from fixed at design time to learned from the user. Predict any next system by asking where its mapping is authored. This section explains why the chapter title carries a question mark and why that question mark is the argument. About 30% of EEG users never gain voluntary control, a failure named the BCI illiteracy phenomenon, and games arrive as the proposed cure. Motivation, flow, and immersion are supposed to sustain training regimes running from 1 session to over 100, or regimes running from 1 session to over 100. The survey then withholds the payoff. Small samples, mostly young healthy participants, missing control groups, almost no direct comparison between conventional and game-like feedback, and user experience assessed by anecdote when it is assessed at all. The structural catch closes it. A game played through a BCI presupposes the control it was meant to produce, so performance near chance level turns motivation into frustration. The cerebral palsy puzzle and the tic-tac-toe boards escape that trap, because there the game teaches the scanning mechanism itself, rather than recoloring the feedback bar. This section explains what a brain-computer interface becomes once it is placed inside virtual and augmented reality. every experiment trades control against ecological validity. VR dissolves the trade by making the whole world a specified variable, and BCI closes the loop from inside it. The brain is at once the controller and the measured quantity. That is the chapter's office in the handbook, the feedback modality treated as an instrument that acts back on the signal it displays. The gain is asymmetric. Rising immersion along Leib's ladder, from desktop to head-mounted display to cave, sharpens endogenous control, because presence and motivation feed sensory-motor rhythm performance. Exogenous paradigms stay flat or degrade. P300 is indifferent across displays, and SSVEP got worse once Legeny embedded the fleck. Presence amplifies a signal. The user generates and corrupts one the display must impose. This section explains where touch enters a brain-computer interface and why the place it enters decides everything about what it can do. Touch enters at two structurally different points, and the chapter's whole argument rests on that distinction. In an active BCI, the user generates the signal, so haptics can only close the loop as feedback. It works about as well as vision there, while feeling more natural. In a reactive BCI, the stimulus is itself the control channel, so tactile cues carry the options themselves. Spatial tactile attention sharpens the P300 exactly as visual attention does. That second placement is what makes touch worth the trouble. It buys gaze independence, and ALS spares tactile event-related potentials, as Silvoni and colleagues reported in 2016. The chapter's role in the book is to mark where a modality substitutes for vision and where it merely assists. This section explains why moving a recording electrode under the skin matters and what the chapter actually delivers. The invasiveness ladder runs from scalp to subdermal to subgaleal to ECOG. It is normally read as an amplitude gradient, closer to cortex, bigger signal. This chapter re-indexes it as a maintenance gradient instead. A needle seated at the bone-scalp interface buys almost no bandwidth over surface, EEG. What it buys is impedance that does not drift, and a contact nobody has to re-gel between sessions. So the deliverable is equivalence. Mu and beta separate. Rest from movement in subdermal recordings just as they do at the surface, meaning control signals already proven. Adequate survive relocation to a chronic mount. Coherence holds below 40 Hz and falls above it. The two electrodes agree on the band actually being used and diverge where each sees something of its own. This section explains how a chronic brain electrode was made to last by inverting the usual relationship between implant and tissue. Every chronic electrode fails the same way. The brain moves, glia wall off the foreign body, and single units drop out. 15% survival at 3 years for the Utah array in humans. Kennedy's inversion is to stop resisting the tissue response and recruit it. A hollow glass cone impregnated with trophic factors invites neural pill to grow through the tip. The ingrown myelinated bridge anchors electrode to cortex, so relative micromotion vanishes, and no exposed foreign surface is left for gliosis to encapsulate. Subject, ER, carried conditionable single units at 9 years and signals at 11. What finally failed was the implanted amplifier. The electrode outlived its own electronics. The chapter's office in the handbook is an existence proof. Invasive brain-computer interface has a lifetime grade substrate. This section explains why ECG occupies a special place on the invasiveness scale and what physiological quantity it makes readable. Invasiveness reads as a smooth cost axis. ECOG marks a discontinuity on it. staying above the pia, subdural, never penetrating tissue, avoids the glial response that degrades intracortical arrays. Yet it sits past the skull's low-pass filter. What appears on the far side is broadband gamma, roughly 70 to 170 Hz, a direct index of the average firing rate beneath the electrode, the same quantity that single-unit recording and bold each capture indirectly, so the chapter's claim is about legibility, not proximity. Two currencies fall out. Broadband gamma indexes cortical excitation. Low-frequency oscillation indexes excitability. Their phase-amplitude coupling carries the disease signatures exaggerated in Parkinson's, absent in Tourette's. A recording modality earns its place by which physiological variable it renders readable. This section explains what actually bounds research productivity in brain-computer interface software. The bound is whether the experiment lives in the code or in the configuration. Brunner and Schalk make scope of investigation the axis orthogonal to raw technical performance. Scope of investigation means how many experiments, emulations, and amplifiers one unchanged architecture absorbs without reprogramming. The field's whole adoption curve falls out of that axis, BC. I-2000 at 1,090 publications, OpenViBi at 236, and every other platform, Simulink, LabVIU, BC, iLab, CraneU, G. Generality disseminates. Speed alone does not. Placed among the handbook's method chapters, this one concedes that a field's methods are only as reproducible as the substrate they are written in. This section explains why single-trial EEG analysis needs multivariate features at all. A measured EEG channel is a mixture of sources. Every method in the chapter follows from that single fact. Blankert's opens with an amplitude threshold at the channel, C, 1 channel, 1 latency, 220 milliseconds. The example is built to fail. The visual idle rhythm bleeds into CZ by volume conduction and drags the trial under the threshold. The distant channel, OZ, then earns its place because it carries the contaminant. It carries none of the signal of interest, and that is exactly what makes it useful. A weighted difference between the two channels cancels the intruder. Spatial filtering is subtraction, and multivariate features are the minimum apparatus subtraction requires. Since the mixing is anatomical, it is personal. That gives calibration, and calibration gives machine learning in a handbook chapter that could have stayed physiology. Signal becomes the class mean. Noise becomes the covariance. This section explains why the choice of feature geometry, not the engineering, decides whether an SSVEP classifier can run in real time. Represent a trial by its covariance matrix, and the object lives on the manifold of symmetric, positive, definite matrices, which is curved. Classification then collapses to a single question. Which class mean is nearest? A mean on that manifold is a Kacha centroid, and a Kacha centroid is updatable, one epoch at a time. No queue onset is required, no session is required, real time becomes an afterthought. Canonical correlation analysis. The incumbent method needs whole session statistics, non-causal filters, whitening, and grid-searched harmonics. It is offline by construction, and converting it to an online form costs accuracy. The chapter's claim is that where the offline and online split falls is decided by the representation upstream of any implementation. The same pattern appears one turn further out. A resting state, which cannot be represented as a stimulus frequency at all, is just another point on the manifold. This section explains the single shape shared by both evoked potential paradigms. Two paradigms, one shape, build a template of what the target looks like. Score every candidate against it. Take the argmax. The P300 oddball paradigm learns its template, one weight per channel and time. Sample pair, fit by least squares, forming a spatio-temporal detection template that the brain's own response must match. SSVP already knows its template, sines and cosines at each flash frequency and its harmonics. So, canonical correlation analysis only has to find the spatial mixture of electrodes that correlates best with each one, and no calibration is needed at all. Supervision migrates. What you cannot write down analytically, you must collect labels for. Everything else in the chapter, the filter bands, the window length, the harmonic count, is parameterization of that single decision. This section explains how Bayesian learning removes the regularization parameter from EEG classification. The regularization parameter is the enemy, and Bayesian learning kills it. Every EEG classifier that works, RFDA, Lasso FDA, SWLDA, buys its generalization with a lambda nobody can set. Cross-validation needs a validation set, and validation data is exactly what a BCI subject cannot have. Validation data is exactly what a BCI subject cannot afford to sit through. Zhang's move is to reread the penalty as a prior. Once the L2 term is a zero mean Gaussian over weights, lambda stops being a knob and becomes a hyperparameter. The evidence itself estimates, marginalize the weights out, maximize the marginal likelihood, iterate. The evidence itself estimates, marginal likelihood, iterate. The calibration cost that regularization exported to the user comes back inside the model. Every brain-computer interface decoder has to assume something in order to survive its own poverty of data. This section explains the move the chapter makes, noticing that the assumption is a free parameter and that it ought to be measured rather than guessed. The signal drifts, non-stationarity, fatigue, drying gel, anatomy. Historically, this was fought in one of two ways, by training the human until the signal overpowers the noise, or by discarding all previous data and recalibrating from scratch each session. Transfer learning imports the assumption from other subjects and other sessions instead. The whole taxonomy then follows from where you install it. Install it in the feature space, and you get a transform that makes one decision boundary suffice for everyone. Install it in the model space, and you get a learned prior over decision rules. Calibration cost is prior quality in disguise. This section explains what a motor imagery, brain-computer interface costs you once you take the stimulus away. Every other brain-computer interface paradigm borrows its trigger from the world, a flashing checkerboard, an oddball tone, so the machine already knows when to look. Motor imagery removes the stimulus, and this chapter is an accounting of what that removal costs. With no external clock, the intention must be recovered from a lateralized power drop over sensory motor cortex. The whole apparatus, the 8 to 30 Hz band, the common spatial pattern filter, the Fisher discriminant, is a detector tuned to that single contrast. Which is why Cho and colleagues spend more pages on sleep, coffee, time slot, and a per-run questionnaire than on classifiers. When the operator generates the event, the operator's state is the instrument. This section explains how two unreliable input channels combine into one reliable command by requiring both to agree. Iges knows where with precision, and knows whether not at all. That is the Midas touch problem. Any lingering fixation fires a command the user never intended. SSBEP knows whether a flicker frequency locked into occipital cortex is voluntary attention. It discriminates poorly among many targets, and it demands per-subject tuning. Their failure modes are uncorrelated. The chapter's actual claim is a purchase order. Throughput is spent to buy tolerance. SSVEP thresholds, unusable in a solo brain-computer interface, become usable once gaze underwrites them. Robustness here means disagreement is detectable at all. This section explains why a P300 speller is best understood as a channel code, and why coding gain alone does not predict how well it spells. Each character's flash pattern is a binary code word. The user's attention-modulated EEG is the received signal, and decoding recovers intent. Earlier information. Theoretic codebooks lost to the plain row and column paradigm because they optimized against a memoryless channel. The neural channel has memory. A target flashed too soon after the previous one elicits a weakened P300, a property called refractoriness, so the code's own timing degrades the channel it transmits through. The chapter's move is to score candidate codebooks by predicted spelling performance with the target-to-target interval folded into that prediction rather than by code distance alone. Optimize code and channel jointly, or the coding gain pays for the damage the code itself does.